Blessings in Jesus, dear friends, and welcome to Catching Up with Jacob. You're not going to catch up with Jacob today because Jacob is in South Africa. I'm speaking to you from Bloemfontein, South Africa. I've been here since yesterday. And there's quite a lot of global significance going on in South Africa at the moment. So that's just briefly what I wanted to present before Catching Up, per se, commences with our team in America and Australia. South Africa, I fear to say this, about 25 years ago, I told Christian businessmen in South Africa that what is happening in Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe with the farm seizures and the destruction of the economy, and when the Black people would become the final and ultimate victims of Mugabe's regime, I said that this would come to South Africa, that this ANC government would bring the country to that kind of a brink. Well, I had no respect for Desmond Tutu theologically. He was a horrible man, morally bankrupt, devoid of any kind of biblical principle. His daughter's a lesbian Anglican clergywoman, and he was the first to campaign for lesbian priestesses in the Anglican Church. He said shortly before he died that he refused to worship a homophobic God and that he doesn't want to go to a homophobic heaven. He would much rather go to the other place. Well, on Boxing Day, the second day of Christmas, he got his present and he got his wish from God. He left this earth. I had no respect for that man whatsoever as a clergyman or as anything else to do with Christianity. He was a horrible man. Politically, however, we did have common ground. He and I were both opposed to the racist injustices of apartheid. Now, apartheid, ugly and wrong as it was not nearly as bad. It was what was going on in Rwanda and Burundi and the Central African Republic and Angola and another number of other Black African countries in Africa that the international media and the mainstream media, of course, didn't want to talk about. You had refugees from Angola and from other countries in Africa, as far away as Nigeria, fighting to get into South Africa to live under apartheid, simply because apartheid was not as bad as what was going on in countries with Black governments. They didn't tell you that, but that's what happened. Nonetheless, I considered apartheid to be wrong because it was racist and it was unjust. And so did Desmond Tutu. The other thing I agreed with him on is that he admitted before he died that the ANC government that came to power with Nelson Mandela and what became of the ANC after Nelson Mandela particularly, was as bad as what it had replaced. And in fact, in many ways, it's worse. Worse for everyone, but again, especially for Blacks. We have people on our Memorial mail list. 10, 12 years ago, we noticed. They're on the Memorial mail list in Australia and New Zealand, who used to be on the Memorial mail list first in Zimbabwe and then in Australia. If you go to rugby games where South Africa is playing, say, the New Zealand All Blacks or the Australian Wallabies, there's so many fans for the South African Springboks. It looks like a home game almost. That is how many white South Africans have left. You see them in Britain, you see them in the United States, certainly Canada, particularly Australia and New Zealand. The white middle class, the skilled labor, many of the professional people have left. The country has become more and more dysfunctional, but the crime has gone out of control. Literally, the crime is out of control and government corruption is out of control and a politicized justice system is out of control. A corrupt president, Jacob Zuma, who has 4 wives and claims to be a Christian, and a clergyman, he claims to be, he was exonerated today, despite the mountain of evidence against him. Again, other people would be prosecuted for the same things, but he gets to pass just for political reasons. You see what happens to a politicized justice system if it is allowed to continue. Well, we have a politicized justice system in the United States moving in the same direction as South Africa. It will reach the same proportion eventually. It'll become unbelievable. The mainstream media made big deal out of the indictment of Donald Trump, which many people believe is bogus, phony. I certainly think it's without sufficient legal foundation. Nonetheless, 20 million in bribes paid to the Biden crime family, as some people are putting it. That becomes page 6 news. That's not the main news. It's about Trump. There's no real evidence. It's politically conjectured almost. But there's two systems of justice. Well, South Africa has the same thing, only has gone further down that road. The United States and other Western countries are going the same way as South Africa. Secondly, the unspeakable crime. People in South Africa will vote for the ANC just because they are Black people and they think they should because of it, even though it affects their own well-being. In Chicago, they got rid of that horrible, horrible woman, Lori Lightfoot, to vote for Johnson, who's as bad or worse. The crime in the Black communities in Chicago is out of control. White people will flee. Black people are going to be increasingly stuck there and being gunned down in the street, seeing the kids shot on the way to school, but they vote for it. In Philadelphia, Baltimore, Chicago, take your pick. Anywhere that happens, it's the same story. Well, I see what the results of that are in South Africa. The crime is so out of control, it's borders on being a war zone in many places. It borders on being a war zone. Even places that were traditionally safer, like Cape Town, are not safe anymore. And again, this is all politicized and all racialized. The unspeakable pilfering of the national economy and of the public purse, the corruption that goes on financially and economically. The United States is going the same way, very much the same way. They're destroying their currency. If South Africa didn't have gold, its currency would be worthless. The rand used to be one of the strongest currencies in the world. I remember there were 2 rand to the US dollar and 3 to the British pound. I remember that. Now there's 20 to the dollar. And it's getting worse. And if they didn't have gold, it would be worse still. Mark my words, as extreme as it seems, the culture of corruption, of incompetence, of promoting people based on skin color without reference to their qualification or lack thereof. And I know some wonderful Black Christians, and I know Black Christians who are not stupid people in South Africa. But generally, people get jobs and promotions based on skin color. The infrastructure begins to break down, and it's getting worse and worse. The culture of corruption politically, the culture of corruption in business, and the breakdown of public safety related to crime. This is what is happening in South Africa. And any country that pursues these same policies is going to go the same way. First, I saw it in Zimbabwe, and I warned it would come to South Africa. Well, now I see it in South Africa, and I'm warning. If America stays on the path it's presently on, the Obama path, America will go the same way. Not safe to go outside your house. That's how it's becoming. Well, let's move on. This week, Biden is again pushing, and an affirmative action is still legal in the military. It's not under the constitutional decision of the Supreme Court. It's under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. It's still there. You have an Air Force general, chief of staff of the Air Force, who many people think is unqualified for his job. He shouldn't even be a general. And now Biden wants to make him chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He says his goals are diversity and inclusion. When you look at what China is doing, when you look at what is happening with Iranian militancy and the precipice of developing nuclear weapons, when you look at what's happening, the last thing you need is somebody interested in social engineering instead of interested in protecting the country. And again, this is the man who they want to make the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to replace Miley, who was nothing but a political bureaucrat with stars on his shoulders. Miley was bad enough. Lightfoot was bad enough, but you have to get somebody worse to replace them. These kinds of decisions happened in South Africa. The same thing. And now they're happening in America. Well, they're gathering this week here in South Africa. I believe it's providential. I'm here at the time. BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Saudi Arabia. The biggest trade bloc in the world with 40% of the world's population. It is bigger than the G7 in totality. Trying to come up with a global currency that will replace the US dollar. It won't be instant, but they're moving in that direction to replace the dollar as a global reserve currency. It has one ace in the hole. Although the Russian ruble is worth a penny or less, although the Chinese yuan is not worth very much and not a desired currency, although that is the case, although the South African rand is almost like Kleenex, blow your nose with it and throw it away. Although that is what it is coming to, they have one ace in the hole. While America has produced quantitative easing under blithering incompetence like Janet Yellen and others, and she's issued more T-bills, another $1 trillion in T-bills just this week. This woman is either out of her mind or she's being manipulated by somebody who isn't. It's unbelievable to have such a preposterous person as Janet Yellen in any kind of a position in the Treasury Department or the Fed, where she used to be, but she is. Now, what is this coming to? Well, they're trying to attack the dollar. Now, what has kept the dollar strong is the fact that its rival currencies are weaker. The euro is weaker. Post-Brexit euro is weaker. The invasion of Ukraine has certainly weakened the Russian ruble. The Chinese economy is in serious trouble. It has reached the same place Japan was in the late 80s, early 90s. The dollar was stronger than any of these other currencies, so it stayed the reserve currency despite itself. But now something else is happening. Forget about Bretton Woods. After Nixon defaulted on the dollar, the euro dollar was the petrodollar. Oil gave the dollar its functional value to a high degree. That is gone now with Saudi Arabia in the direction that they are going. China has brokered a make-believe peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, but Saudi Arabia still has ambitions to make a deal with the United States and Israel. That may help a bit. But essentially, you are taking these countries. They will now have petro-wealth, and they will have gold backing, even though their individual currencies are garbage, even though many of their own economies are in trouble. Only India is growing. Saudi Arabia is kind of static, despite its manipulation of oil prices. Despite that, despite China's problems, despite Russia's decline, despite all of these things, they have petrol backing like the dollar had, and they have gold backing like the dollar had, but no longer has. I don't think they can do it overnight, but it's going that direction. Until now, the United States had the advantage of being able to write checks that you don't have to cash. What is going to happen to the United States as an economic and political power when that's no longer the case? And it has been engineered. It's hard to believe that economists could be that incompetent. It's hard to believe it's not deliberate. It's difficult to believe that the people running the Treasury Department and the Federal Reserve are actually that stupid. I mean, some of them are, like Yeltsin. What is the repercussions of this going to be? This is another reason it's going to create pressure to go to a digital currency. Well, if you're going to make a replacement for the dollar, we're going to go to something digital, and we're going to control it through the SWIFT system. So they'll try to make an alternative to the SWIFT system. Meyer Amschel Rothschild founded international banking as we know it. He was trying to do something about the notorious history of anti-Semitism in Europe. He said Jews will never have the political influence to stop anti-Semitism in Europe, which was mostly Roman Catholic. He said, we'll never stop it. However, give me control of a nation's money supply, and it matters not who writes its laws. Now, the House of Rothschild was never able to stop anti-Semitism. The Holocaust happened anyway. The pogroms in Russia happened anyway. He didn't do it. His model didn't achieve what he hoped it would. Nonetheless, the model remains in play. Now, I'm not talking about conspiracy theories about Jewish bankers or any of this stuff. J.P. Morgan was no Jew. David Rockefeller was no Jew. Chase was no Jew. Brown Brothers Harriman are not Jews. Barclay Brothers in England are not Jews. If you look at the international banking establishment, yes, there are Jews in it, Goldman Sachs and so forth, but it's hardly a Jewish enterprise. You cannot say that. It never has been. Donald Drist for Citicorp, he was the biggest chairman, most powerful chairman Citicorp ever had, probably. He's not a Jew. David Rockefeller ran Trace Manhattan. He was not a Jew. The Mellon family, America's biggest banking dynasty, not Jewish. I'm not talking about Jewish conspiracy theories. That is nonsense. But I am talking about international banking. And these people know how the game is played. I've often said in the United States, and my apologies to those who heard me say it at least a dozen times. For the last 30 years, I have been saying in the United States, there are not three branches of government constitutionally mandated: legislative or congressional, executive or presidential, and the judiciary. It's not that. You have a fourth and a fifth. The fourth is the Federal Reserve that is controlled by international banks, as is the European Central Bank. And the fifth is what is now called deep state. I used to refer to it as the intelligence community. The deep state has more control over foreign and international policy than the State Department or the Pentagon, and the Federal Reserve has more control over the economy than the Department of Treasury and the Department of Commerce and the Department of Labor combined. That is the reality. The Bank for International Settlements, the World Monetary Fund, the IMF, all of these things. Well, there is a challenge now to the status quo coming about through BRICS. Individually, these countries are nothing. Their currencies are nothing. But you put enough of them together. You put enough pennies together, you make $1. You put enough pennies together, you make $1 million. The size is what's the issue. Secondly, is the increased gold and petrol backing, particularly if Saudi Arabia becomes a player. That's the second. The third is, again, the unbelievable, huge chunk of the global population that lives in BRIC countries. These things that are taking place in South Africa this week and next week are of pivotal importance to the future of the world, to the future of the United States, to the future of the G7, to the future of the EU, to the future of Great Britain, to the future of Australia and New Zealand, to the future of the Western world. Daniel talked about the kings of the North and the kings of the South. Now, that had a fulfillment in his time with the Battle of Actium and things he predicted about Mark Antony and Cleopatra and things of this nature that were predicted in the book of Daniel, this kind of conflict. But for some time, we've seen a conflict between the kings of the North and the kings of the South again. The developed world and the developing world. Most of the developing world is in the Southern Hemisphere. Most of the developed world is in the Northern Hemisphere. There is this great conflict. We've pointed out before that even before the Iron Curtain collapsed, Ostpolitik and détente were not going to be the main conflicts of the world anymore. It was going to be between the North and the South. I said way back when that the Falklands War between Argentina and Britain was the first North-South as opposed to East-West confrontation. That is, communist, capitalist, whatever, Soviet, Anglo-American, whatever. The Falklands was the first North-South. The other wars you've seen in the Gulf are, again, between non-Western countries and these other countries of the Islamic world. With economic development and industrial development and high-tech development comes reduced birth rates. That's even happening in China. It's happening in the more affluent countries in Latin America. There is one place whose population will continue to grow. China is waning. South Korea and Japan are in long-term trouble. If it wasn't for immigration, much of it illegal, the United States would be in trouble demographically. But there is one place that can still churn out people like there's no tomorrow, because for them there is no tomorrow. I speak of where I am situated at the moment, Africa. Africa is going to be important because it is the only place in the world that is not demographically challenged. And the dependency of the rest of the world on African minerals, all kinds of minerals, things like not just gold and diamonds, but things like cobalt. The whole Sahel, the area between Black Africa and the Sahara, okay? That whole strip, you see the Wagner Group. One of the reasons Putin did not want to get rid of Wagner, even though they tried to depose him. Russia needs them to maintain military leverage in the Sahel. You have a tremendous ordeal and a conflict with France taking place in Niger, a country that still has slavery. While the stupid people promoting the woke agenda in America and elsewhere are talking about the slavery that disappeared 150 years ago, they're not telling you about the enslavement of blacks by Muslims that still exists in Mauritania, that still exists in Niger, that still exists in Chad. They're not telling you about those things. Again, the hypocrisy and the corruption of the media speaks for itself. Africa is going to be something and someplace that is going to be crucial to the rest of the world. That will, in large part, fuel this conflict between the kings of the North and the kings of the South. The kind of border crisis that Biden and Obama have caused in the United States is not as serious. It's very serious, but not as serious as what you're seeing happening with the invasion of Europe by North African Muslims, by Africans, and by Muslim refugees from the Middle East. And Turkey is manipulating and controlling a large part of this for its own interests. People going in small craft across the Mediterranean from Libya and other countries, and they're coming up to Libya from other countries in Africa, trying to make it to Italy and so forth, and they're doing it. They are doing it. And then they're heading to the north of France, to Calais area, where I just was recently, and making their way illegally into Great Britain. It's only 21 miles in the Pas du Calais, in the Dover Straits, between England and Dover, the White Cliffs of Dover and France, the Calais, Dunkirk area. It's just there. The North-South divide, the North-South conflict. Now, we are told in the book of Daniel that this kind of strategic conflict that will have tremendous political and economic and cultural ramifications, sociological ramifications, is going to be one of the things that fuels the rise of Antichrist. That is what's happening. And it's happening quickly. So here I am in Africa. Please keep the believers, black and white, and I've met some wonderful black believers who love Jesus. And I'm looking forward to meeting more. But this place is hellish. If you want to know what the future of the Western world is going to be like, look at South Africa. It was a westernized country with a developed infrastructure that's been turned to garbage. Just like Detroit has been turned to garbage. Just like most of Chicago has been turned to garbage. Just like Philadelphia is being turned into garbage. Just like Baltimore was turned to garbage. That's what's happened to South Africa. I remember the first time I was in South Africa when apartheid ended. I wouldn't speak in segregated churches. I didn't come here till apartheid was over. And I came and I drove down Commissioner Street. That's like the Fifth Avenue in New York terms of Johannesburg, most affluent country in Africa. And the Carlton Center, that was like the Rockefeller Center or it like the Midtown Manhattan of Africa. You couldn't drive down the street, Commissioner Street, in the daytime. There were squatters in the skyscrapers. Squatters. They destroyed the city of Johannesburg. Destroyed. Now Cape Town is going the same way. A medical doctor from Britain was shot dead day before yesterday because he made a wrong turn on his way from the airport to the city. And riots with cab drivers and all this crazy, unbelievable breakdown. Just a breakdown of any kind of order or public safety. Well, I can certainly see that happening. When I looked at those ridiculous riots in Ferguson, near St. Louis, and the other kinds of riots that happened in other cities, in Greenville, North Carolina, it's the same thing. Same thing. The tribalism in Africa. A evangelical Afro-American clergyman wrote a book. I forget his name, but I watched him interviewed. He was a clever man. He said that the gang warfare taking place in the cities of the United States among blacks is simply the American equivalent of the tribalism of Africa. Boy, was he right. He couldn't have been more right. He hit the nail right on the head. South Africa is shocking in what's happened to it. And I've seen it deteriorate over the last 25 years. I've seen it disintegrate and get worse and worse. I saw that happen to Zimbabwe. And now I'm seeing those same trends in Britain, America, and elsewhere. This is the reality. Am I desperate? Yeah, I'm desperate. I'm desperate for Jesus to come back. Let us hasten his coming. Let us preach the gospel and make disciples while we still have time. Let us stand up to the corrupted church, to the heretics, to the financial con artists. Let us preach the truth while we still can. We will not be able to do it too much longer, the way things are going. May God have mercy. Thank you so much. Please keep us in prayer. And again, please pray for the believers here in South Africa. God bless.
Hello, and thank you for watching Moriel TV. There are so many things that are happening at Moriel Ministries worldwide, from the Philippines to Japan, to India to Africa, and back to Europe and the United States. So many of our brothers and sisters are spreading the good news of Jesus Christ to this lost world. We are so thankful for your prayers. God has been faithful and has blessed us in so many ways. If you'd like to partner with our efforts abroad and at home, please take a moment to click the link in the description and help us as the Lord leads you. Thank you very much, and God bless.